Trump supporters are whites. Particularly white men are the most reliable voters for Republicans and Trump. Trump crushes it with rural voters in particular. That is another extremely strong base of support for the Trump voters. Non-college educated voters are particularly white non-college educated voters very strongly go towards Republicans. And then the other important constituency tends to be wealthy Americans. Wealthy Americans tend to vote more often for Republicans. So, looking at those core groups, what Pew did is Pew looked at where in particular were the shifts that propelled Biden to victory in 2020. So the shifts that Pew accounts for are, in particular, they note that Biden significantly improved with young voters, particularly turning them out. So that was attributed to be an important factor, the high youth turnout. The shift towards suburban voters was considered a particularly important one. And then, white men. Biden actually did significantly better with white men than Hillary Clinton did, despite, again, being an important constituency of Republicans. And then, the other really important shift that Pew accounts for is independent voters. So independent voters, people who are not self-identified Democrats or Republicans, they attribute that to be, along with suburban voters, the second most important shift with regards to explaining why Biden won and Hillary Clinton didn't. So it's the independent voters. So if you were to look at the shifts with regards to who Trump improved, Trump actually improved somewhat with white women over Hillary Clinton. But also, and this one I think is one of the ones that is particularly important for this year, Trump also improved somewhat, not huge numbers, but significant nonetheless, with minority men, particularly Hispanic men. And so, in fact, over the last couple of years, particularly in the last midterm election, what you have seen is that, in general, Republicans have done better, particularly with Hispanic males. There were congressional districts in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas that used to be reliably Democratic votes that shifted to Trump. So I think it's very important to keep in mind those particular shifts, because when I see the strategies that the candidates are employing, I think that this in many ways kind of explains what the candidates are trying to do. So when I look at the strategy of Harris, what I see with Harris's strategy is really kind of an attempt particularly to court independent voters. I see this as really at this point one of the crucial parts of Harris's strategy, and in particular I see this with regards to Harris's outreach and courting of Republican voters. Now, in particular, where we have seen this with regards to Harris's strategy is having surrogates who are Republicans. So in particular, Liz Cheney has been an important ally of Harris in attempting to create some sort of crossover appeal to disenchanted Republicans and more conservative independents. So that has been an important part of her strategy. And a lot of what she has attempted to do with this is to basically speak to Trump as being out of touch with American values. Particularly speaking to Trump's desire to use executive authority, as well as in basically speaking for admiration of dictators and things like this. This has been an important part of this type of appeal and part of the strategy. Basically, to try and make the appeal to Republicans that, again, Trump is out of step with American values. Now, I am somewhat skeptical, and Professor Fierro is going to go into more detail about this. I'm somewhat skeptical of Harris's ability to appeal to Republicans, considering how progressive the position she took back in, particularly the 2020 primaries were. So there's certainly reason to be skeptical of that, but particularly considering the shift of independents towards, particularly away from Trump towards Biden, I think that may be something that may gain some sort of traction. We'll certainly have to see with regards to that. We have also seen recently in Harris's strategy, appeals to women. And I think this in many ways is going to be perhaps the most important group that may decide the election. One of the most important groups. There's a couple groups that I would consider particularly important, independents being one, but women. So in particular, what we have seen is a strong appeal to abortion rights. So we are living in a political landscape in which the right to abortion was overturned with the Dobbs decision. And this has been really one of the most seismic shifts in American politics in a very long time. So I very much see in Harris's strategy attempts to appeal to basically women of all sorts and portray herself as a champion of reproductive rights and Trump as an opponent of reproductive rights. So it'll be interesting to see what will happen with regards to whether or not the women who left, in fact, the Democrats for the Republicans in 2020 come back into the fold. Certainly we have seen Democrats in special elections, in congressional elections, in some cases outperform expectations. And particularly when reproductive rights have been on the ballot, it has been an important factor with regards to improving Democratic turnout. So there are abortion rights ballots in Florida, for example. I believe Arizona has one as well, so it'll be very interesting to see the impact of that particular issue. And in fact, the basic question with regards to Harris, who would be the first woman elected president, I mean, although it's, to be fair, Edith Wilson was the first female American president. Sorry, a little obscure history joke there, but it really remains to be seen. The gender dynamics of this election are intense. When I talk about Trump's strategy, I'm going to refer to appealing to men, right? So I mean, I really think that there is a pretty intense gender divide at play with regards to this. And finally, the last thing that I'll sort of note with Harris is that I think that you've seen recently with regards to Harris's strategy, particularly attempts to close the gender gap with men. So Obama has been an important surrogate for Harris recently. I think that this has been really attempts to keep black men in the Democratic fold. So I think that those shifts that we have seen in the electorate with regards to those movements of minority men towards Trump and the Republicans, I think that this is something certainly that Harris seems to be aware of. She recently went on Charlemagne the God's podcast. I don't know anything about Charlemagne the God, but I know this is part of those attempts to appeal. This certainly makes sense in light of the shifts in the electorate that we have seen before. So that's what I really kind of see with regards to Harris's strategy. I very much see an attempt to build a broad electorate and appeal outside of the Democratic base. I think that that's really kind of a key thing. Keep the coalition intact, and particularly to bring in women in particular, but also political independents and or disadvantaged Republicans, that discontented Republicans. I think that is, to me, the core of the Harris strategy. So with regards to Trump's strategy, what I see more is really kind of trying to energize his base. So the core of Trump's message has basically been immigration. This is just such a central part with the Trump rallies, and the rhetoric about immigration has gotten much more focused on criminality, violence, in some ways, really to me, portraying immigrants in a very dark type of a way. This is something which I see as really kind of touching upon veins that have been in American history. Particularly the 19 teens were a strong era of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. And so with this message, I very much see this message as trying to appeal to his core constituencies, particularly men, particularly non-college educated men. And in particular, there is something to be said about the economic challenges faced by this particular group of people. And whether or not the message that immigrants are responsible for the economic challenges faced by this group remains to be seen. So with regards to this, though, that I think that in some ways that this is a bit challenging, particularly considering the fact that this group of voters is generally less reliable than other voters. Generally, it's the case that the more education you have, the more likely it is that you are to turn out. So I think in general that this strategy does pose some challenges, but certainly in the Harris camp, this is a challenge as well. Considering the fact that youth are also an example of a low propensity voter. So I think that with regards to both of those groups, those are also going to be key constituencies that will shape this election. How many young men without college degrees turn out, is really in many ways going to be one of the critical questions here. To me, what I see as Trump's core appeal beyond his base is the idea of, are you better off for years ago? And just general appeals to economic mismanagement by Democrats. This, I think, does have the potential to be a powerful message, considering the fact that voters' views of the economy right now are not very rosy. We have gone through a period of significant price increases, and despite the fact that inflation has cooled off for a number of months, voters tend to blame Democrats for those particular increases. So I certainly think that that's one issue that will be, could be a potentially powerful one, but in some ways gets overshadowed by the focus upon immigration in this particular case. And so I really think that with Trump too, a very important part of his appeal is generally to men. And so with the strategy I see, for example, bringing in WWE wrestlers has been part of this appeal. Hulk Hogan, recently he went out to one of his rallies speaking with the Undertaker's theme. I do not know professional wrestling very well, but Trump has had connections to professional wrestling for a pretty long time. So it's the gender dynamics to me are very stark. And so where I think that, particularly if Trump gains traction among particularly minority men, and whether or not his appeals to minority men are successful in light of his harsh rhetoric on immigration, this could be another one of those things that could be particularly significant. But, with all of these things, that I think it's going to be interesting to see how much this, particularly impacts female voters. So again, the gender dynamic is very sharp, but I think in some ways that, appealing to men in some of these ways was alienating women. So, just to kind of sum things up, I think in many ways that it's just incredibly uncertain. And I think that the great degree of that uncertainty really kind of comes down to the nature of the voters that each of the candidates are courting. Again, for Trump, particularly the non-college educated men, for Harris, the youth. So, there's a lot of uncertainty. And that is really going to be one of the major themes touched upon by Professor Fierro. So I will turn things over.
All right, so I will be repeating some of the things that Professor Fauss said, but I want to start with the national scene, because what we have are national polls that indicate who's winning. And I'm using Real Clear Politics averages. I'm using Nate Silver, he's a very well-known pollster, and a host of others, because one poll alone, no matter who's conducting it, not reliable whatsoever. And the reason for that is because what you really need to do is look at the aggregate of the polls. A host of polls over time will give you a better indication than any one poll. I don't put much stock in newspapers doing polling. Read about the New York Times or Siena doing a poll, or the Washington Post. They tend not to be quite as accurate as some of the professional pollsters that are out there. So that's what I'm using. One thing we can say about the polls regardless, though, is they are not a predictor of who's going to win 2 weeks from now. All they can do is indicate trends. They can indicate what's happening at the moment. So they can take a picture, but they don't indicate anything for the future necessarily. And that's true of national polls as well as state polls. But there have been a multitude of national polls, and what we see is that Kamala Harris is ahead in a bunch of those polls, anywhere from 1 percentage point to 5. You'll see an occasional poll that says Trump is winning nationally. I wouldn't put too much stock into those. The national polls overall suggest that Harris is winning the national vote, right? But national polls can be useful in assessing trends. They don't tell us who's going to win the presidency, because in our system, as I hope all of you know, we determine presidents through the Electoral College. And so what the Electoral College is, just very briefly in the context of this conversation, is a state-by-state voting, and whoever wins those states gets a certain number of electors, right? And the electors depends on what? How many you have depends on, someone tell me?
Population, electoral
population, right? So the more populous a state is, the more electoral votes. Connecticut has 7, California is 54, and the magic number of those electoral votes is 270. So whoever gets to 270 wins the presidency. Again, it's state by state. And pollsters, political scientists, others have identified 7 so-called swing states that will determine this election. In other words, it's very close in these states. The electoral count in each of them will give one candidate or the other an advantage, and the others, that is to say, the other 43 states are pretty much determined who's going to win. Texas, it's a Republican state, Trump will win. Florida, likely to go Republican, right, very likely. Connecticut, likely to go to Harris. So 7 states, though, are up in the air. They are Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So it's in those states that we will see who will win this election. Right? They're also referred to as battleground states, and you can even reduce it down to not just those 7 states and the millions of people who vote there, but 40,000 people in those states, 40,000 combined, that can switch the results one way or the other. And Professor Fauss mentioned some of the independent votes. Among those 40,000 are independents who sometimes vote Democrat, sometimes Republican, and who they go to might determine this election. So imagine that in a nation of 350 million people, 40,000 could determine the election results. You can see the electoral numbers for each of these 7. Nevada has 6, Arizona 11, Georgia 16, so on down to Pennsylvania, which has 19 electoral votes. Now, it does seem, if you question the pollsters and others, that Trump has more of a path to victory because he can win a couple of those states without winning Pennsylvania and still win. Whereas Harris, it seems, needs Pennsylvania more. So it may boil down to Pennsylvania. But before we get to that, this is the real clear average in each of the 7 states. And you can see here what the spread is. It's so close, right? In these, and this was granted a week ago, but I don't think the numbers have moved too much. They have shifted a little back and forth, but you'll see the advantage that Trump tends to have in these 6 out of 7 states, but it's all within the margin of error. What that means is that if there's a 3% margin of error, it could swing in Harris's direction quite easily. So if it's 47 to 45 Trump in Wisconsin and the margin of error is 3 points, she could have 48 points and he could have 44 points. So we really don't know from this alone whether or not Trump has that lead that real clear says he does. And in fact, there's some polls that say just the opposite, that she has a slight lead. Regardless, it's all within the margin of error. So it's hard to determine one way or the other. I will tell you, the trend has slightly, ever so slightly, and this is according to a Democratic strategist and pollster, Doug Schoen, a host of others. There was a UMass Amherst poll done recently that say that the trend has shifted in his favor ever so slightly in these swing states. What that means, though, as Professor Fauss pointed out with these different demographics, is up for debate. We really don't know how they're going to vote. But the trend line seems to be pointing, at least for now, toward Trump by the slightest of margins. I will tell you, just to put this all out there, some experts disagree with that, but that's what I'm seeing after looking at the aggregate of these polls. Again, I mentioned Pennsylvania being critical. It has 19 electoral votes, so obviously it's important, especially after all the other states that are clearly blue states or red states have been determined. 19 is going to make a heck of a difference. And so a lot of political scientists and others have said that it's this swing state where 1 percentage point has tended to separate these 2 candidates one way or the other. That will determine this election, especially because I think Harris seems to need that state very more. You'll notice, by the way, that she's been campaigning in Pennsylvania quite frequently, as has Trump, but she's there all the time. She knows, her strategists know the importance of this state. It's one of those battleground states that often determines the results of any presidential election. Both campaigns, by the way, have spent in excess of $350 million in this state alone. We're talking about a lot of money. In fact, record numbers of funding for both candidates. Both candidates and their vice presidents selections have appeared there. J.D. Vance for Trump and Tim Walz for Kamala Harris. And so everybody knows the importance of Pennsylvania. As I mentioned, got to be careful of polling. In fact, Professor Fauss and I have been talking all week about how it's kind of a fool's errand to offer any solid predictions at this point. Although we have a better window into who might win now than we did, say, a month ago, we really don't know. Experts really don't know who's going to win because there's so many variables involved. And as we can stress one variable, another may be just as important that we have not discussed, right? So polls are flawed by nature. Some are, of course, more unreliable than others. So just be careful of that if you're interested in politics and you're reading about this stuff. Not all polls are created equal. Right? There's also a distinction between public and private polling. And that doesn't get covered all that much. Public polling is the things you read about. New York Times does a poll, ABC does a poll, Nate Silver does a poll, Pew does a poll, right? All of these are public polling places. But each party is doing their own internal polling. Sometimes they're called private polling. Those take money to conduct, and they are seen as much more reliable. In other words, these candidates have an inside view of what's actually happening on the ground with these internal polls. So that's an important thing to remember as well. And what I think the internal polling has shown is that the Democrats are a bit worried in these battleground states, which is why recently Kamala Harris has pivoted. She was very hesitant to do these one-on-one interviews. She was not involved in town halls of any kind when she first became the Democratic Party nominee, but recently, over the last week and a half or so, she has shifted her view. Now she's all over the news, and she's doing as much of these interviews as she can. And that suggests that there is a strategy shift because of this internal polling. So again, that's an important factor to note here too. I will say also, and I'll show you another slide later, polls historically have underestimated Donald Trump's popularity among some groups. That happened in 2016 and 2020. So for instance, in 2020, Biden, about this time, was to have won, according to the predictions, by about 7 points nationally, and by 4 to 5 points, let's say, in these swing states. The reality was he won the popular vote by about, 4%? And he won the swing states by 1%, a little over 1%, a little under 1%. And so the big question, I think, and we really don't know the answer to this, is whether or not the polls are going to underestimate Trump's support again. Now, I know that good pollsters, they have made efforts to correct that flaw. Sometimes pollsters, they interview or they ask questions more of Democrats than Republicans, right? And if that's the case, obviously you're going to get a kind of shift away from the average of Republican and Democrats, and you're likely to see better results for Democrats. Or sometimes rural voters are not asked who they support, and rural voters, as Professor Fauss said, tends to support Trump, or non-college educated, and so on and so forth. So the big question, in some sense, is whether these polls are going to underestimate Trump's support again. Maybe they'll overestimate because of the overcorrection that pollsters have made. Again, we just don't know. The other big factor, and we were talking about this earlier in the week, is voter intensity. Which party and which supporters, Harris or Trump, are more intent on voting? Because voter intensity, which can't be really measured in any poll, is what determines elections. If the Democrats are rip-roaring mad and angry, the mere idea of Trump, the authoritarian fascist dictator, winning an election, if that makes them that angry, they'll show up in droves and they'll pull Kamala Harris over the top. The same is true of Republicans. If they believe that Trump has been the victim of a political prosecution in New York and Georgia, across the board, if they believe that Trump supporters are completely neglected and they're kind of cast off as these ignorant, uneducated people, they may be rip-roaring mad and go to the polls in large, large numbers. So whoever has the intensity advantage could very likely win this election. And again, we just don't know at this point. Both sides, I will tell you, seem very galvanized. But who has the advantage, we don't know. The issues, Professor Fauss talked about this. Now, you can't really see all of these, but these tend to be the top issues. Not exactly, and not in this order particularly. Sometimes immigration goes to the very top, and sometimes abortion goes third, but always is the economy. That always seems to be, in every poll, #1 issue. And more specifically, it's not the economy per se, but it's affordability. That's what is really driving people, it seems, this election. And I would say that's maybe one reason why Trump has a slight advantage now. Professor Fauss is right that inflation has calmed down, but that's calmed down after years of going up during the Biden years, right? So if inflation was at 15% from 2021 to 2022, and then rises another 5% in 2021, 22, and then another 3% in 2023. That means overall it's up about 20%, which is what you're all seeing in your wallets, right? Cost of McDonald's is through the roof. I can't take my kids to McDonald's anymore. It's horrible. So that kind of thing really hits people hard, and that is what voters mean when they say the economy is not doing well. That's what voters mean generally when they're asked the question, do you think the country's heading in the right direction? And 70-some-odd% say no. That is almost always in an election a clear sign that whoever is in power is going to lose. Now the caveat here is Kamala Harris is not in power, it's Joe Biden. So whether the economy and the affordability issue rubs off on Harris remains to be seen. I think there was a time where she was interviewed by The View and she was asked, how are you different than Joe Biden? And she couldn't think of anything. That was a pretty big turning point, because what she wants to do, and I think she's been trying to do that somewhat successfully over the last few days, is separate herself from Joe Biden. He's not a very popular president. Another issue that's not really talked about much is campaign funding. Money often determines elections, right? And Harris has a really big advantage overall with campaign funding. Her campaign has raised more than $1 billion, far outpacing Trump by a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 margin. So if money determines elections clearly, then Harris has a big advantage. She could have more TV advertising, more radio advertising, more advertising online. How many of you have seen a YouTube video recently where right in the middle, Trump appears or Harris appears? And you're like, what happened here? I was watching, I don't know, basket weaving, and suddenly these candidates appear, and it's horrifying. Right? But the fact is they can spend all this money on campaigns because they have tons of money. You'll notice Harris and wall signs maybe more than Trump, unless you go to Southington. That's another matter. For some reason, Southington is a hard Trump country for whatever reason. But the fact is that these are all ways in which these candidates can appeal to people with lots of money. Now, it's hard to quantify the fundraising advantage that Harris has, but certainly there is an advantage here. And it's often been the case that funding can determine elections. William McKinley beat out William Jennings Bryan in the 1896 election because he had like a 10-time advantage over Bryan. And McKinley, of course, ended up being shot in Buffalo, New York, so he probably regretted how much money they spent. But the fact is that funding is important. Now, this is where Professor Fauss really dug deeply into who supports whom. But Harris is doing better among women across the board. Women of color, white women, and the polls indicate different things, but anywhere from 7 to maybe 10, 11 points. She has that much of an advantage over Trump with women. I won't go into why, plenty of reasons, but some are more obvious than others. Trump has not historically done well with women, even his wives, maybe especially his wives, but you know what I mean, and Harris clearly has the advantage there. Trump is doing better with men, especially men without a college degree. He has also, and this is very decisive too potentially, he's decreased the margin of support that Harris has with men of color and Hispanic men. And that's significant. It was a chief indication of who would win a presidential election in the past. I would hear this all the time from political scientists. If the Democrats get 80% or below of African American support, they can't win an election. And if they get less than, say, 63% of Hispanics to support them in an election, to vote for them, they can't win an election. Well, we're at that point, and then some. If that is a determinative factor, then Harris may be in trouble, because her support among Hispanics is way below 60-some-odd%. It's like 55% to 47% or 45%.
Hispanics in general or Hispanic men? Hispanic men in particular, but across the board as well, he has lessened her margin, but especially among Hispanic men and African American men. We were talking about this, and I think that's important. So if Hispanic women go out in droves in support of Harris, then maybe that is mitigated by the number of Hispanic men who vote for Trump. Same with African Americans. So not sure, but that certainly those numbers are changing. As we've noted, Harris does better among the college educated. Trump does better among those without a college degree. Some call it working class support that Trump has had that has cut into areas traditionally that Democrats do well in. This is why 3 of the swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, are so critical, because there's a heavy blue-collar population there. Also, registered voters. This is important too. Sometimes pollsters ask, well, among likely voters, who are you going to support? Well, likely voters doesn't mean they're going to vote. Again, that voter intensity factor, right? But here's some numbers that should give the Harris campaign a bit of concern. In 2016, the number of registered voters favored Democrats by 3 percentage points. In other words, there were 3% more registered Democrats than Republicans. In 2020, the percentage climbed to 6 points. And you see the difference between 2016 and 2020. 2016, Trump wins. 2020, he loses because of that upward shift of Democratic registered voters. But look at 2024. The Republicans are up by 1 percentage point. And I think those are the kinds of statistics that have the Harris campaign concerned. In Pennsylvania, by the way, Democratic voter advantage has declined by half. Something like they had a 600,000 registration advantage to now 300 and something thousand. That's pretty significant. What that translates into in terms of who votes on election day, I should say election days, because as you might know, we have early voting in lots of states, including Connecticut, opened up this past Monday. But on those election days, does the number of registered voters translate into actual voters? That's another big question. This is what I was referring to earlier. In 2016, Clinton, at this point, October 16th or so, she had a 5.5 point advantage, according to most polls. In 2020, Biden had an 8.9 point advantage. And in 2016, Trump won. Those polls were off by a pretty large number. Biden ended up winning the national vote by about half that. And in 2024, look at Harris's advantage, where she has an advantage, only by a couple of percentage points at the most. So if that holds up, if Trump's support is underrepresented, then that spells trouble for Harris. If it is not, and there's been an overcorrection, well, maybe we'll see the polls swing in favor of Harris. So the other factor that hasn't been talked about much are third-party candidates. In an election where 40,000 people can determine the results, well, of course, third-party candidates like the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, can have a very big impact. She's on the ballot of every swing state with the exception of Nevada.
Why not?
I'm sorry?
Why isn't she on the one in Nevada?
Well, it's hard to get on the ballot in each of these states. You need a certain level of support. And sometimes you don't get to that critical level, and so you're not on the ballot. She was able to do that in 6 out of the 7 swing states. Chase Oliver, which probably most of you have not heard of, he's the Libertarian candidate. He's on the ballot in every swing state. And even if either one of them gets 10,000, 20,000 people, 50,000 people to support them, that could swing the election. And the polls be damned. Doesn't matter what the polls say in that case. Cornel West, famous African-American scholar, he's on the ballot in Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. Could that have an impact? Will that cut into Harris's support? Will Chase Oliver's support cut into Donald Trump's popularity? Robert Kennedy, we know he's dropped out. He has come out and supported Trump, but he's still on the ballot in Michigan and Wisconsin because the state boards there have refused to take him off the ballot, even though he's requested it. So maybe some people, thousands, vote for Robert Kennedy in Michigan and Wisconsin, and that could shift the election in those states to Harris. These independent candidates can collectively also, not just individually, but as a whole, they can definitely sway the election one way or the other. Or they can cancel themselves out. Again, we just don't know. The other thing that I came across in the last few days are lawsuits. Some are calling this the litigation election of 2024 because there are more than, or about 100 lawsuits being filed by Republicans or Democrats, especially Republicans. Republicans, by about 70%, have filed lawsuits in the various states, not a surprise, especially the swing states, demanding that, for instance, drop boxes be reduced in these states, or that voter ID laws are very tight. Only those with IDs should be able to vote in certain states. So that's where Republicans are headed. They want to limit the number of people who can vote. They are calling it election integrity. Of course, their detractors call it something else. They call it anti-democratic, and that's where the debate is there. On the other hand, you have some Democrats filing lawsuits as well, and those are mostly in favor of expanding voting access by extending registration deadlines and loosening voter ID requirements. So again, this is a litigation election, and if you have tens of thousands of ballots thrown out by some judge in Georgia or Wisconsin, that could make a lot of difference as well. Well, the outcome, again, this is not a prediction. I would say, though, that based on all the material I've looked at, if the election were held today, Trump probably would win, but the election isn't being held today. It's a very fluid situation, changes day to day. And it's still 2 weeks away, and 2 weeks in politics is a lifetime. Anything can happen. They sometimes call it an October surprise. Who knows? Maybe it will be demonstrated that Trump is a bot and he'll break down and conk out and he won't even run. Or maybe Harris will gain the upper hand because some major piece of news will occur that makes Trump look terrible. I know that there's a lot of terrible news about Trump. Doesn't seem to be sticking, but you never know. These October surprises are called that for a reason. And the other thing that concerns me most is what happens after November 5th. Given how close the election may seem, I know that Professor Fauss has indicated to me that oftentimes what seems to be a 50-50 draw is actually more lopsided, and we may see that. I kind of hope so it's decisive. But if it's close, we may not know the results on November 5th. And how the American people act, hopefully with integrity and with responsibility, is going to matter in terms of this country's future. What this country relies upon, and one of the factors, by the way, that's important and is against Trump, is the fact that when he won in 2016, even when he lost in 2020 by a slim margin, January 6th had not happened. And now people know January 6th happened, and they look at Trump's responsibility and all that, and that could be a big factor in this election that may switch people's support in favor of Harris. Right? So all of these things are there now, but what happens after November 5th is important. We rely upon a peaceful transition of power that is essential in a republic, and if it doesn't happen, then we're in trouble as a country. So anyway, that's my presentation. We will be glad to take questions or comments now. If you have any, we have a few minutes. We can certainly go past 3 if you'd like. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I was thinking about foreign policy. It was listed as the third most important issue for voters. And Israel has vowed to retaliate to Iran's attacks in the next couple of weeks, likely before the election. How important do you think that calculation is going forward? And considering Biden's relationship to Bibi, do you think that Biden is doing enough to ensure that Bibi's kind of controlled before the election?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the Biden administration has as much sway over the Israeli government as it would like these days. I think Netanyahu has, you call him Bibi, Netanyahu has made great strides to distance himself and wants to be his own person representing his own nation. Now, we haven't talked too much about foreign policy, but it is a factor. It was third, I guess, on that list. But some say it may play a critical role in Michigan, where Harris, there's a heavy Arab American population there. And given the Biden administration's support, although tepid support, I would say, compared to past years and decades, that those Arab Americans may stay home and not vote for Harris. And if that's the case, that could sway Michigan. So it certainly it is a factor, foreign policy, and how it cuts into domestic policy, and it influences national elections. Whether or not Israel attacks Iran in the next couple of weeks, I'm not sure. I would think that attack seems imminent from what I've heard, but who knows?
Well, a lot of people have said that some of Trump's appeal is he's kind of tried to paint himself as a peacetime president compared to Biden. And I feel as though if a wider war does break out, like it's seeming to break out right now, that would probably do some numbers for Trump, I would
Agreed.
imagine.
I think that's right. Address that.
I very much agree with you.
Well, I think also, before I get to your question, just to pick up on that point, as far as foreign policy, Trump has attempted to portray himself as someone who brings peace rather than war. However, I think also his foreign policy statements are filled with lots of bluster, that if he is elected, he will resolve the Ukrainian crisis before he is sworn into office. I don't know that anyone believes that. I don't think Trump believes that. But that kind of thing could be just as irresponsible. I think he had the good fortune in a lot of ways of having relative peace, although there were conflicts in the world that the Republicans don't like to talk about during his presidency. So I don't think he has the advantage he thinks he does.
And I'll just quickly say, I think that may be one of those areas that would be one of those things that might push a Republican more into the Harris camp, considering her support for traditional liberal internationalist American policy, whereas Trump's much more of an isolationist, which I think is something which matters to, a certain type of Republican voter.
Right. I think what you've seen is Trump and his supporters trying to pay Liz Cheney's support as warmongering, that it was the Cheneys who supported the Iraq War, and that isolationism is kind of taking hold of the Republican Party. Yes?
Yeah, the American Constitution said only citizens can vote. Why Democrats said, we don't need almost 14 states, they don't need voter ID. Do you think it's a big problem for the file of election to both of sides? Because Constitution needs only citizens can vote.
Understood. I will say
That's
that.
not limited some people member, that's Constitution. That's a common sense.
I think
You
the
agree
one
with
state,
that?
well, if you let me finish, I'll try to answer that. But I understand the passion involved in that, for sure. There is a distinction between citizens and non-citizens. There should be, according to the Constitution. I know that Republicans are trying to make this an issue. To what extent non-citizens are voting, you'd have to give me evidence that that's the case. And I can't say I've looked deeply into it, but I don't believe that non-citizens are voting in mass anywhere near to sway the election. But I will say, I will refer to you.
The
But
instances,
it's true. You don't believe, but it's true. 14 states don't need ID to vote. And
No,
many
that is true.
non-citizens register.
but that does not basically account for the fact that voter fraud is basically something like the number of fraudulent votes cast in American elections over the past decades, documented cases of fraud, is in the 10%.
Do you think the Biden 2022 or 20, the Biden curve is fraud?
What are you talking about?
Biden election, the
Oh, the
curve.
betting markets?
Yes, you see
So
that
the betting
famous
markets-
curve.
Betting markets are generally, first of all, betting markets are done by non-citizens. American citizens are actually not allowed to participate in betting markets. And betting markets are not a good prediction. I think they're not polling when it comes down to it. It's different. The motivations are different.
And I would also add that when we talk about non-citizens,
Do you think we vote the candidate, we should focus on what's their way to solve this country's problem, 1, 2, 3, 4, or only woman or man, abortion, or the color? We don't need to focus that. We should focus which policy is good, benefit for this country.
Absolutely.
understood.
Yes.
We're not saying anything different. I agree with you on that score. But your initial point about citizens, non-citizens
Yes,
voting,
and this is another, one is citizen, one this,
I
we
get
should
what you're
focus,
saying.
because I saw you talk about race, talk about women, talk about gender, talk about color, don't talk about what they, too much about their policy to solve this country's problem.
Okay, well, all right. In our defense, we had
Because-
20 minutes. Can you let me finish, please? Okay,
Let
you keep
you
interrupting.
1
I
hour.
would prefer
And then-
I answer your question. So thank you. But we have 20 minutes to discuss some of the key issues. We looked at the economy. We looked at affordability. Yes, the issues, I would urge all of you to go and look at the issues very specifically. We touched on that. If you were here a couple of weeks ago, we looked at the issues in sharper focus. So this is a continuation of other events that we had. I don't know that you were here. I don't think so. But it's an ongoing thing. And we're having another event on November 12th to look at how those issues played out as well. So, thanks for your question. I appreciate it.
Now I feel bad for raising my hand because I'm actually just going to touch on
No,
some of the
please,
stuff
no,
that
no,
you
of
said.
course. That's why
I
we're
think
trying
this
to
is-
answer questions.
I think this is where the Democrats are making a very large mistake because I believe that there is a very large segment of the legal immigrant population that feels exactly the way she
Absolutely.
does. Me being one of those members, I feel the exact same way. I don't know why the Democrats would make such a big deal about voter ID. And for people that see that who are legal immigrants, it really makes them feel the way she does, right? Like, why would they do that? The only possible reason you could have to do that is to cheat, right?
Right.
That's the message that they're inadvertently sending.
Right.
I mean, Democrats want you to have an ID to drive, to buy liquor, to, have a library card, you need ID for all of these things. And just, I don't know if you've seen some of the videos on YouTube where there's, some of these independent reporters have gone out into black communities
Right.
and asked that same question. And they're like, what? Why do white people think we don't have IDs? We need ID just like everybody else needs ID.
Right.
Why would white people think that? And
I
You know?
think that you both have tapped into something important. I think that if what Democrats don't do well, when they charge that Trump is anti-immigrant, what they don't do is make a distinction between immigrants who are here without the proper documentation and those who are here. Because immigrants themselves who went through the naturalization process or going through, they are resentful of that. And the polls indicate that legal immigrants, as they call them, they are just as conservative on some of these issues, including voter ID, as other Americans are. And so I do think Democrats have a problem with that. There may be all sorts of good reasons why you wouldn't require ID, but I think there are some reasons that are not as good as the others, and you touched on them. I've never heard a good answer to the question, if you need an ID, picture ID to drive, why can't you have one to vote? That's a decent question.
And I'm not arguing one way or the other.
Right.
I'm saying your reasoning or the answer you give for why you're doing that, you need to articulate that in a manner that
Understood.
people understand. Yeah.
All right, there are other questions in the back. We will try to get to you as well. Okay. Robert, go ahead.
You forget my name for a second.
No, not at all. I wasn't sure if I were to pick you or Matthew, but then he pointed to you, so I chose you.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't forget your name. How can I? He has the same name as the lead singer of The Cure. I'll never forget that because I love The Cure. Anyway, go ahead.
I think we've been over this across before. So my question is like, how do you think? I'm not sure if like this question was asked already, but how do you think like who we choose as our next president will affect like our allies and how they view us representatively? Because I know under Trump, a lot of our relationship with our allies was kind of hurt a bit.
It was kind of what?
Hurt a bit with some of our allies. A lot of our allies they question like how much we can trust us or how become who we are, especially since like Trump has stated was like very much an isolationist and like we're such a major thing. Like one of the biggest things that we're in is NATO, and we're pretty much like the leader of NATO. Like let's be honest.
All right. Good question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly, I think that it would be pretty consequential, particularly considering Trump's disdain for NATO, for example. NATO has been a critical part of American foreign policy for a very long time, and that could just significantly shift. If America is not viewed as a reliable partner in the NATO alliance, then I think that very much could push Europeans to go in different directions with regards to their foreign policy. I think it's entirely possible that you could see a military buildup in Europe, particularly considering Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, I think that is very significant. I think that it's the sort of thing that viewing foreign policy very transactionally is the sort of thing that I think would probably empower more behavior seen in Russia, for example, with regards to the invasion of Ukraine. So I think in general, weakening alliances. I think that the general critique is that weakening alliances would probably lead to greater instability in the world order. So that's one perspective that, for example, more traditional foreign policy would have that perspective.
So just to kind of balance, not counter that a little bit, but here's the thing. I feel like in foreign policy, the United States is stuck between a rock and a hard place. And the reason for that is...
Do you mind speaking up just a little bit higher?
Yeah, sorry. So I said that the U.S. foreign policy is stuck between a rock and a hard place, and the reason why is we have, on the one hand, Donald Trump, who, it is true, presided in a period of greater peace than there is now. Whether or not he legitimately takes credit for that is another matter. He will, but I don't think that's actually true. But yes, he engages in a lot of bluster. He tends to offend allies and enemies alike. He tends to cozy up to dictators, as has been said. On the other hand, Kamala Harris has not articulated any foreign policy whatsoever, at all. There's no vision there whatsoever. She seems very, very, shall we say, uneducated on foreign policy. And I think our enemies see that, and I can sense that they're salivating over a Harris victory, potentially. Now, of course, she's not in charge of foreign policy alone. The president has subordinates. Presidents have underlings who help them craft foreign policy, but she has not been able to articulate anything resembling a vision, and I think that's much to her danger and to her detriment. So I'm not sure that we're in good standing with the world either way, from my perspective. Anyway, so Matthew.
I have to go.
Thank you, Professor Fauss. I appreciate
Thank you.
your... Answer a few more questions. I have time. Of course, I know you had one, but hold on, let Matthew.